Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Michael D. Gordin, author of Pseudoscience, a very short introduction published by the Oxford University Press. It'll be released on April 27th. So real quick, let me say this about the bookstore, Wellington Square Bookshop. I'm proud that we stock every volume of Very Short Introduction series at the shop, and I highly recommend them for anyone who wants to learn a little about everything. You may miss a few things like an introduction to the Kardashians or Dancing with the Stars, but I think we can get by without a few of those. So there's about 800 of them now, and we're running out of room. So Michael is the Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Princeton University. Some of his prior works include On the Fringe, Where Science Meets Pseudoscience, actually very similar to this book, kind of amplified and corrected. Einstein and Bohemia, Scientific Babble, How Science Was Done Before and After Global English, The Pseudoscience Wars, Immanuel Velikovsky, one of my heroes, and The Birth of the Modern Fringe, and many other books, mostly dealing with history, much of it Russian history. So the way I look at it, science is like observation, and then identification, and then you describe it, and then you do the experiments. And so you have a theoretical explanation of natural phenomena. Then there's quasi or quasi, depending on which side of the pond you are, which is ideas that resemble real science, but then they haven't been backed up with any real evidence. And then, as Michael and I agree, the real fuzzy definition is pseudoscience, which kind of is a proposition or a finding or a system of explanation that is presented by its proponent as science, but it lacks, for want of a better word, the rigor essential to the scientific method itself. So pseudoscience can also be the result of research that is flawed, like artifacts and stuff, or puffery, or promotion. Like we all know about Bigfoot, Nessie, Uri Geller, spoon bending, astrology, mesmerism. And Michael gives us lots of history and information about those, but there's scores of others. What we may first think of, me or the layperson, those of us who are at the bookstore, as malarkey, you know, but in actuality, it may be a heartfelt effort at science like alchemy or cold fusion. So let's learn about demarcation, which is an interesting concept, and how that idea posited by Karl Popper sends us on the beginning of this fascinating subject. So welcome, Michael, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. So where would you like to start?
Well, I guess where you start, because it really sets the stage, because demarcation kind of puts one on one side and one on the other. And Karl Popper did it. And then you kind of say, you know, maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong. So I think for the lay reader, I think that's a really important place to start.
Yeah, so the demarcation problem, and it's important that it's a problem because it's not solved yet, is a term that a philosopher born in Austria, eventually settled in the United Kingdom, named Karl Popper, came up with to describe what's been a long-standing problem, which is how do you differentiate things that look like valid knowledge claims from things that almost are valid knowledge claims, but there's something a little off about them. And this is a problem that's gone back to basically anywhere there's a system of knowledge claims, whether that's ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, ancient Greece, there's been this fight, like what counts as a legitimate claim to knowledge. And so Popper tried to design a clear mechanism, a single test by which you could determine whether something counts as a science or merely is trying to be a science, but is failing. And that makes it what he would call a pseudoscience. So he wants a bright line distinction. And his bright line is something called falsifiability. It's now in biology textbooks for high school students and middle school students. I'll explain what the thing is quickly, but I want to say in advance, it doesn't quite work. And most philosophers would tell you, yeah, it doesn't quite work. And it doesn't work for interesting reasons. But first, what the standard is. The standard is when someone makes a knowledge claim, like light will bend around massive bodies and you could measure that during an eclipse, that statement has a property, which is that it's falsifiable. I have told you an observation that you might make, and if you fail to make it, I'm wrong. So my statements about the natural world have this possibility of being falsified. For Popper, that's a scientific claim. It doesn't mean that it's right. You could make the measurement and in fact it is wrong, and then I reject my hypothesis. But at least it was a candidate for scientific validity. And that's what science is, hazarding things and seeing whether they work. You're going to be wrong a bunch of the time. That's totally fine. The non-falsifiable claims are when I make a claim, I cannot formulate a claim that is able to be proven false. So a classic example, which is the one that Popper uses, in fact, he designs his theory to invalidate these as scientific, is Freudian psychoanalysis, where I can say such and such behavior means this person is a latent homosexual. And then someone says, well, what about this other person over here? They're clearly gay, but they don't have that behavior. Oh, well, that's because they're in denial of the original behavior. I can never actually name something that can be falsified by an observation. The other classic example is Marxism, where everything will lead to revolution. So inflation goes up, that will cause revolution. Inflation goes down, that will also cause revolution. There is no falsifiable claim. So Popper thinks that is your standard. If you cannot formulate a falsifiable claim, you are in the realm of pseudoscience, not science. And the problem is it doesn't quite work.
Well, what about, you talk about cold fusion, you can talk about the matrix and the simulation or Marvel and the multiverse, but it seems like cold fusion isn't really science, because how could you prove that it's false? Because you can't look at it, like whether we live in a solipsistic world.
So cold fusion, this is an experiment from 1989 where these two electrochemists claimed they did fusion at room temperature, which, if it were true, would have transformed the entire world. We would have no climate issues at all. We would have infinite energy. It would have been pretty amazing. Turns out it's not true. So they claimed they made an experiment. And it's actually an interesting test case, because when they made the experiment, they're like, here's the experiment. We think we have measured neutron fluxes. And more importantly, they measured an increase in heat. And they said, there's no way you could get heat in this vessel of water with two electrodes in it of this magnitude unless something like fusion is happening. So they made an observation about heat. And they measured some neutrons, but not enough by the judgments of physicists. So at that point, it's a falsifiable claim. And then people started poking at it, and people couldn't quite replicate the experiment, and they weren't able to quite validate it. And then the physicists went into this chemist's domain and said, we understand fusion and this can't possibly work. And they, in about a month after the public announcement of it, kind of tore it apart. At that point, we're in a zone where it's basically a scientific claim was made and debated and rejected. It gets a little weirder for two reasons. One is there's an allegation that there was fraud involved in the original announcement. And fraud is one of those things that's not science and it's not pseudoscience, it's just kind of something else. But there are still people who do cold fusion. There are still people who try to do this experiment in the jar and think that they can do it. And they keep finding really no results of significance. And they keep coming up with explanations for why they're finding no results of significance. So then they meet Popper's criterion of being pseudoscientists, because every time they make an experiment, they have an excuse for why the experiment didn't yield what they had predicted in the first place. And so you can never catch them admitting a mistake. And so it was science for a while, and then it turned into something else.
Well, the reason I chose those three, because obviously I understand them. The one I don't is one that you delve into, which is string theory. Because, okay, you go ahead.
So string theory, which now has been relabeled quantum gravity, is a theory, and I want to state from the start that pseudoscience, I think, is a category that doesn't really exist. It's a category that scientists use to label doctrines they really don't like. And string theory is not just a category that many theoretical physicists like, it's arguably the dominant form of theoretical physics in certain aspects of exploring the natural world. But it started out as a very weird place. So what string theory wants to do is unify our basic picture of matter and its interactions, which is called the Standard Model, which unifies the electromagnetism and then behaviors of subatomic particles together in one theory. And what it says is that when you get to a high enough energy, those forces are indistinguishable, and one theory can explain them all. The problem is that there's another force it doesn't account for, which is gravity. And you have to get to a really high energy in order to make gravity unified with these. And string theorists are attempting to try and describe that theory that would happen if you had a particle accelerator larger than the solar system, or if you were there at the Big Bang, you would be able to observe these things. But of course, we're not at the Big Bang, and we can never have that particle accelerator. So what they do is create theories that would account for things, and then lower the energy and see if you get an approximation to our real world that we're in. So this is a little dodgier. It starts out as a very fringe theory in the 70s, but then it has some interesting theoretical predictions and results at the lower levels that people say, well, maybe this is actually an approach to a unified theory, but it can't be tested empirically. All it can be done is mathematically manipulated, and you can find contradictions to it. Is it science? Is it not science? There were plenty of theoretical physicists in the early 90s who said, this is not physics, what you're doing. It's either math or it's pseudoscience. But that opposition wilted away, and now it's part of physics. So things can move from the edge to the center as well.
That's one of the things that you talk about that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, is it's not only where and what, it's when. And then you go into, people diss astrology and alchemy, but you talk about it, these guys really were scientists and names that we know. And what they did gave us knowledge that we now use in, for one of a better term, real science. So talk about those two, because I think that'll help people understand a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah, those are both terrific examples. Thank you for asking about those. So astrology it's almost like the headliner of the category of pseudoscience. It's what everybody has in mind. And what they're thinking of are those columns that are in newspapers that tell you what your week is going to be like. Those things actually start in the 1930s, and they're a result of a royal birth in the UK where people thought it would be fun to predict the royal's future, and it took off. That's not what astrology was for most of its history. It's very ancient. It's from the classical world. There are astrological theories in basically every culture that has astronomy. The Mayans have it, the Chinese, the Indians, the Greeks, the Romans. In the Renaissance, so in the 15th, 16th century, it's not just a science, it's the dominant science. And it meets all of the criteria we like. It's incredibly empirical. They have data points on all the planets. They measure them every night to know exactly where they are. It's highly mathematical, where they try to calculate both where the planets are going to be and where the planets were and look for conjunctions. And it's very well remunerated. Almost every prince, every town has a town astrologer. The town astrologer of the Austrian city of Graz for a long time was Johannes Kepler, who's one of the founders of modern astronomy. Galileo cast horoscopes, although Kepler actually really believed it, and Galileo, it's not less clear what he believed. Copernicus seems to have believed quite a bit of it. So everybody who's doing astronomy is also doing astrology. And I say somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and I think this is fair, it's kind of like economics. It's a predictive science about the future based on a lot of data and models that's sometimes wrong. And we pay economists today, and we listen to what they have to say, even though we know they're sometimes wrong. And that's where astrology was. And the intuition behind it is actually not as crazy as it sounds. Do celestial bodies affect stuff on Earth? Well, maybe you'll think Mars, Jupiter, probably not, but the sun clearly does, and the moon affects the tides. So we live in a world where celestial bodies do affect stuff on Earth, and astrology was a generalization from that. By the 1700s, it starts to really fade, and people stop thinking that this is a plausible, mainstream scientists stop thinking this is a plausible way of understanding the universe. Many traditions around the world and many people still believe in astrology, but it's no longer part of the scientific conversation. So it was until it wasn't. Alchemy is a little different because it involves some subterfuge. In the early modern period, which is what historians call sort of the 16th, 17th centuries, there are lots of people who experiment about matter. And they use the word alchemist or chemist interchangeably for what they do. There is a picture we have of an alchemist being the person who tries to make lead into gold. And some of those people tried to do that. They were also looking for an elixir of immortality. Some of them tried to do that. But most of them are trying to understand the properties of metals and other substances and make things out of them that are surprising. And as I said, the terms are interchangeable because it looks the same. They have a furnace and they have glass retorts and brass canisters, and they try to do experiments of various kinds. The thing is, there's a kind of public chemistry, which you would publish. And then there's this private chemistry, which you only circulated among your friends because you thought it was dangerous knowledge. And you would use code names for things like the tail of the green lion or like the silver belt of Zeus as a way. The green lion's real, the Zeus thing I just made up. But they talk about these various things. And those are just code words we now realize in the last 20, 30 years for actual substances. And if you decode it properly, you can do the experiment that they describe in this florid language and actually get the same result they predicted. So there was this community of artisans and philosophers all working in this zone. Isaac Newton spent more time working on alchemy than he spent working on celestial mechanics or mathematics. And Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, also spent a lot of time doing this. And Boyle did the weird stuff. He was looking for gold, as well as being the founder of modern chemistry. And then in the 18th century, there's a sort of PR campaign to get rid of the weird people over here and professionalize a kind of chemistry out of it. They're still doing the same stuff. They're still doing titrations and assaying, a lot of similar practices. But by 1800, alchemy is a dirty word. That thing is a pseudoscience, and chemistry is a proper science. So there's been this split again. A split that in 1650 would have looked a little strange, and in 1550 would have been nonsensical. People would have been like, what? We're all doing the same thing. So when matters.
Well, yeah, right. And that's what I was getting at, because if you contrast that with nitwits, and they're nitwits who believe in the flat Earth Society, talk about falsibility. I mean, it's so easy to prove they're wrong. And I was going to tell you, the illustrations in the book are great. And you have that illustration of the flat Earth with the wall of ice surrounding it as Antarctica. But, how is it possible that a good number of people in the world today, maybe even growing, believe this ridiculousness?
So the flat Earth it's really kind of an interesting puzzle because it's new. I mean, there were theories of the flat Earth in antiquity, but Plato and Aristotle knew the Earth was round. Everybody knew the Earth was round, for a very long time. There are disagreements about how big it is and so on, and whether there's land on all parts of it, but everybody knew it was round. And in the last 20 years, there's been this movement for flat Earth. And the picture is that the North Pole is the center and the world spreads as a disk. And that implies a bunch of predictions. One is it should take a lot longer to go from South America to Africa than from North America to Europe in a plane. And it doesn't. It actually, it works like a globe. So there are plenty of predictions that could be falsified and in fact are. There's looking over the horizon and seeing something a boat get bigger and bigger as it gets closer because it's coming over the Earth's curvature. You can see the Earth's curvature from the Concorde, which doesn't fly anymore. So there's lots and lots of evidence. and there's the space program, where you have pictures of the Earth. So to believe in the flat Earth theory now, you have to have a set of basic beliefs about empiricism, which is I believe what I can see, and what I see around is flat. So I don't see curvature. So you first have a distrust of instruments, which is a position that people have had over time. It's a strange position to have now, unusual. Second, you have to believe in some kind of conspiracy. You have to believe that the pictures we get from space are not real, that they're faked for some particular reason. This has always been the thing that's perplexed me about flat Earth theory is I understand why the UFO people would claim there's been a cover-up of UFOs. I don't understand who gains from a belief that the Earth is round, that they would want to delude people from the truth of the Earth being flat. I've never had that fleshed out for me. There's a wonderful movie called Behind the Curve, a documentary made where this guy interviews quite sympathetically a bunch of the people who believe in the flat Earth as to why they hold this view. And it's quite interesting because it shows a couple of things. One, it shows these conceptual things that look very confusing to us, like why do you go only 2 steps and not 3 steps towards your line of reasoning? But it also shows that they're genuinely, many of them genuinely really interested in investigating the natural world. They do experiments to try and prove the Earth is flat using lasers. And the movie ends with them doing an experiment where the guy is convinced it will prove the Earth is flat, and it actually shows curvature. And he's just at a loss. He's like, I have to figure out what's going on here, like, because this shouldn't have happened. But it shows that for a lot of the people who are on what I call the fringe, on the out, they admire science. They want to be scientists. They're just doing science of a different sort. And that's why they don't think they're pseudoscientists. They think that the real theory is flat Earth. And so figuring out why they think that is that not only kind of an interesting way to see their world, but it's also to understand why is science why are they understanding science so differently from other people? How did that happen? And can it be remedied?
Well, we'll get to the kind of nasty ones like eugenics and Aryan physics. Yeah. But before that, so I had this friend, fundamentalist Christian, great guy. He was my personal trainer, Chris. And he believed in this young Earth theory that the Earth is 6,000 years old. I said, what about the fossils? He goes, well, God placed them there to test our faith. And I said, how can you be so idiotic? And he goes, Sam, how can you be so idiotic? And then I started thinking, well, maybe he's right, because I couldn't disprove it.
Mm-hmm. And in particular, creationism is a really interesting example, and I go to it a bunch of times in the book because it has a long pedigree. Although the young Earth version, where Noah's flood produced everything that we now see, is maybe 100 years old. That idea is relatively new, but it also is very well funded and very well propagandized for. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. There's a lot of advocates of it. So we have a lot of information about it. So why do people who think the Earth is old think it's old? And it's actually the age of the Earth is a hard claim to falsify in Popper's terms, because we can't like do an experiment again and restart the Earth and see how old it is. So why do we think the Earth is old? Well, why do we think fossils are old and older than 6,000 years? Well, someone has to date those fossils. There's 2 basic ways of doing that. One is you figure out the sediment that it is in, the layer of the Earth, and you're like, that layer was put down 3 million years ago. And therefore, this thing is 3 million years old. And that raises a bunch of questions of how do you know that sediment is 3 million years old? And there's a whole lot of explanation of that. The second way you do that is by radioactive dating, where you measure the mixture of certain isotopes of radioactive elements which decay over time, and then you use that as a clock to go back and date it. So the creationists, first of all, attack the sediment dating system. They're like, there's no good reason to believe these things, and they have a lot of arguments, which all geologists would say are not true. And then they attack the radioactive dating mechanism and they say, here's all the things that are wrong with that. So they're doing stuff that we expect scientists to do. They're interrogating, they're testing, they're double checking. It does happen that every time they test, they end up with a result that confirms 6,000 years old, Earth was created in 6 days. And that the flood, which happened a couple of centuries after that, explains the Grand Canyon and everything else. On the other hand, they would say, well, Darwinists, they always have the same answer for everything. The answer is always natural selection. Every time you find a new species, they say natural selection. And that, to them, is a symmetric situation. And most of them would, not most, I wouldn't say, a certain segment of them would say there's two kinds of ways of doing science. There's Darwinism and then there's creation science. And they're just different ways of doing science about the natural world. And we don't yet know which one is right.
Yeah, I know.
The scientists would disagree with that characterization.
But if you look at if you switch it to intelligent design, you look at a beautiful butterfly and you go, how is that possible? Especially its life cycle. It lives 5 days. It starts out as a pupa and then a caterpillar, and you go, okay, well, because you have an semi-infinite amount of time in which all this stuff can be figured out. But it's still hard to wrap your head around about me looking out the window now and seeing what I see in the flowers and looking inside the flowers and the intricacy and, like Dawkins and the Blind Watchmaker.
Yeah.
So I can see how people would think that.
Yeah, it's very appealing, precisely because it's really the first hypothesis of natural philosophers was design, because it seems to make the most sense. It's like things seem to fit. Like this hummingbird has the beak just long enough for this flower. It looks like it was all built. And it is hard to believe that that's randomness. It's just randomness and drift and genetic mutations that produces this perfectly interlocking mechanism. There were many critics of design even before. Like there's, yes, a lot of stuff fits together. And then there are also wasps that lay their eggs inside living things that then paralyze them and consume them while they're alive. And you're like, well, did God design that? That's pretty cruel. And sort of awful. And Darwin can explain that a little better. So, but there are many of these examples of things that just look so intricate that you can see why design is an attractive hypothesis. The reason why scientists prefer Darwinism over that is that in addition to being able eventually to explain this other thing, it makes all these other parts fit together that we would have a hard time explaining otherwise. Things about where species are located on the Earth, why there are no snakes on islands, and stuff like that. Why there are no large quadrupeds on islands either. They had no way of getting there, etc.
Well, let me ask you a simple question, putting you on the spot, because you mentioned it a little bit in the book. What do you think happens after we die?
What I think personally, nothing. So this is this is sort of, as you know, like, and you're putting me on the spot. Like, in the book is a historical and philosophical discussion. This is like it's a scientific guess what happens after we die, and I tend to fall towards a fairly materialist point of view, and it's hard for me to picture much else happening. I don't say nothing, because what happens is you decay, and then your elements get recycled into other things. That's a very depressing thing to think about a lot, so I don't think about it very much. So like, that's the way around it.
You kind of mentioned, or I'm thinking you're mentioning, that people who have the near-death experiences
Yeah.
and see the light and their family waiting for them and calling to them.
Yeah.
I wonder what natural selection, I mean, like pain, you can understand. There's a deer screaming and the other deer stay away. Makes perfect sense. But why would natural selection create, if indeed it did, this illusion of going to heaven to make death more easy to take? But why would it want to do that?
So, and I'm not a specialist in this, but I think there are two explanations that I've heard for this. One is that one. It's a kind of analgesia. It's like sort of like so that the death is a little easier. And so there was a mechanism evolved to make the passage simpler. Another is
God's nice. Why would they do it? Why? Because God's nice.
no. I think natural selection because people like. This is why I don't buy that one that much. But like it's that people that species have evolved in such a way that a violent, painful death is not selected for in the same way, and that therefore, as genes drift over time, people select for non-thrashy, violent, screaming genes that end up producing this. The other explanation, which I think makes sense, is that it's what evolutionary biologists would call a spandrel. That is an artifact of other things. So a spandrel is an architectural term from when you have two arches meeting. You have these flat spaces where they meet, and those things are filled with art in medieval and Renaissance churches. You might think they were designed to hold those paintings. That was deliberate, but it wasn't. It was just that, like, when you connected the arches, you end up with a space. And so people came up with a reason to fill it. It could be that the way our brain is set up is very complicated for lots of natural selection reasons. And when we die, as it shuts down, it has the effect of producing a bright light. And that's just a byproduct of this incredibly intricate mechanism that has no evolutionary function at all.
That makes sense.
It makes sense. It could be the case that that's true. A thing about this after death stuff, William James, who was a psychologist and philosopher, wrote a fascinating book called Varieties of Religious Experience, where he's actually investigating seances and all these other attempts to study parapsychology. And he thinks that most of them don't hold up to empirical evidence. Like when you actually investigate the claims and talk to the people, there's holes in it. But there's one exception, which is when someone dies and someone at some great distance who knows them has a vision of them. Like, and we've all heard or had this experience where your uncle is on their deathbed. You don't know that, but you think about your uncle that day. And James thought, and this is 130 years ago, James was like, that's too well attested to be just an accident. So like, seems like something's going on there. I don't think something's going on there, but you can see how when you start trying to investigate rigorously, you have to evaluate the fact that you have a lot of testimony from people who seem reliable. You have very many confounding answers. And as a result, you have a messy science. And that messy science has things in it that now seem to us pseudoscientific, that are implanted in it. And that's just because of the process of investigation and the fact that we don't actually know that we're right. We have reasons to believe that some of the things we believe are pretty close to right, but we're not ever 100% sure.
I remember there was a story about Stephen Jay Gould giving a lecture, and he asked for questions, and one woman raised her hand and said, the other day, this is why you're wrong. The other day I was laying in bed and I thought, the FedEx guy is going to knock at the door now. And he did. And Stephen Jay Gould says, how many times have you thought that the FedEx guy was going to knock at the door and he didn't?
Yeah. And the thing is, we have a selection problem. We don't remember those, right? Like maybe you think about your uncle every couple of hours and you just forget it.
It's like USB plugs. You think you always put them in the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly. Because and you always think, like when you're playing like a game like Tetris, like, oh, I just at the right moment they gave me the piece I needed, and you're like, actually, it's just that you notice it. So there are many of these cognitive biases that feature into the ordinary conduct of scientific research, but they also have a large role to play in many of those fringe doctrines because they tend to gather around salient observations and focus on those. Like the flat earth people highly privilege their own sensory apparatus in their head. And if that's what you think is the most important data point, then the world looks flat for the most part. And we would say that's a cognitive bias of some sort, but they privilege that and have arguments about why they privilege that. And then we have to debate it.
Let's get into the reason why I want to get into what I call the nasty stuff is because our world today is tending, in my opinion, towards that. So if you go into the Aryan physics and if you go into eugenics, hey, it was like at the stupid ass Republican debates in 2015, they asked all those 15 morons, I shouldn't do this. They asked them all, how many of you, raise your hand if you do not believe in evolution. And every single one raised their hand. It's not the emperor has no clothes, it's something else, and I can't articulate it, and it goes to the eugenics and Aryan physics.
Yeah, so there are many interactions between science and politics, and the fundamental, I'm going to get to exactly what you're talking about in a second, but the fundamental postulate is that there's no non-political science. Like, science is always involved with politics. It's just that usually it's in the form of you need funding and the state funds you and you apply for that, or you have to make sure that you adhere to code, or you don't actually torture people when you do your experiments. There's all sorts of ways in which political decisions factor into science. The things I call these kind of hyper-ideologized sciences are a particular set of doctrines that are somewhat more extreme than creationism, but you can see a similar phenomenon in effect, where under certain political regimes, usually authoritarian, but not always, a particular doctrine gets state support, or at least, if not the state, significant backing because of its affinity with an ideology, and there's enough repressive apparatus to actually enforce it, so to make it the dominant idea. So the case of Nazi Germany is one where it happened and the physics example failed, but it's interesting that it failed, but they tried it. Of course, the eugenic, racialist, racist, genocidal part, that didn't fail. It was stopped by the end of the war, but they were implementing it. But the physics one was an argument posed by two disgruntled older physicists who said that all this relativity and quantum stuff is too mathematical, too disjoint from everyday experience. It seems like it's fakery and it's pseudoscientific. In fact, it's Jewish. And so there's this Jewish physics that we associate with Einstein, and Einstein is the main category here. There's a lot of non-Jews also making this science, but they focus on the Jews. And we need to purge Jewish physics so that we have Aryan physics, just the right stuff, which is basically Newtonian science. And they start arguing for this in the 1920s. And then when Hitler takes over in 1933, they're like, now's our chance. We can get this installed in the schools. We can get the universities to stop teaching relativity, et cetera. And they make a big push for it. They try to get Heisenberg disciplined for teaching quantum theory and relativity. They label him a white Jew as a sort of fellow traveler. The SS interrogates him, and he ends up getting let go. And the compromise is you can teach all this relativity and quantum stuff, you just can't mention Einstein. Einstein is public enemy number one for the Nazi regime for a bunch of reasons: the Jewishness, the pacifism, the fact that he talks about how awful the Nazis are on a regular basis, all of that. So, but they never get relativity and quantum theory banned because other scientists who work with the Nazi state are like, look, we need to actually make electronics, and we need to actually build things, and we can't train a generation of people who don't know science, who know false science. So they end up failing these two people who wanted to do Aryan physics. But for a while, it looked like it was going to be the case that quantum theory would be banned within Nazi Germany. In the Soviet Union, a science is actually banned. Mendelian genetics is criminalized from 1948 to 1965. So in the 30s, there starts to be a debate about whether Mendel's genes, so the idea that there are particles of heredity that combine, whether that's true, which is what most people who call themselves geneticists believe, people who studied heredity, or whether it's the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Like the reason a blacksmith's son is strong is because the blacksmith has big muscles from working, and that's inherited, something that happens to you during your lifetime. We now generally believe that that doesn't happen for the most part. There's complicated nuances to that statement, but there's a debate that goes on where a guy named Lysenko argues that genetics is false. It's a pseudoscience. And the geneticists are like, no, we're actually doing pretty much real science. And in 1948, Stalin intervenes and bans the genetics. Stalin dies in 1953, and then Khrushchev keeps the ban in place until he's ousted in 1964. And then in 1965, they don't fire Lysenko, but they demote Lysenko and they bring genetics back. So there you have an ideological debate about, there's a Marxist explanation for why inheritance of acquired characteristics is supposed to be better than genes. And you have an ideology and a repressive apparatus and a desire to enforce it. the effects of this on Soviet and then later Russian biology are still pretty severe. You lost a generation of scientists who couldn't work on this stuff, and it proved very hard to rebuild in the 70s and 80s. Eugenics is another example of this, but that happens in democracies more than in autocracies, where in the US, until basically, well, the laws get off the books in the 60s, but they stop being enforced in the 40s. There are a series of mandatory sterilization laws for people who are considered handicapped or mentally defective or what have you. These are enforced in racial and class ways quite severely, and California has by far the largest number of these. That's a case where there's an ideology about the ability to improve the stock of the race by weeding out the bad ones and promoting births of the good ones. And there's an enforcement apparatus in the form of marriage certificates. This is why it's actually why you still have blood tests to get married, is old eugenic law from like the 1920s that's still on the books. So those things are still, those rules are oppressive apparatus designed to enforce a particular ideologically congenial science that suits certain prejudices of the time. And those things are nasty. I mean, they're also, and this is, I guess, the nice part, they're rare. Like that kind of combination of a state or financial power and a doctrine that is wildly at variance with the mainstream is unusual. The state enforces all sorts of science all the time. Like it approves certain drugs to be safe or not safe. So it makes certain claims about that. It approves vaccines. It does all sorts of things. So we don't mind it when the state enforces correct science, but these cases where the state lends all of its authority behind science that is conceived by the mainstream of the scientific community to be incorrect, that's rare. That's the good part. So the fact that the politicians don't believe in evolution, as long as they don't do anything about it, it's not sort of a private belief. It sort of does, it likely won't affect much of how they govern. But once it starts to be enforced, you end up in a very dicey territory that has a nefarious history.
You know, it's funny. I always thought it was good that the Nazis did what they did, because if they had treated Heisenberg more fairly and other Jews, they would have probably gotten the atomic bomb before us, and we'd all be speaking.
I mean, in a sense that it's hard to do the counterfactual, but that could have happened. I mean, and the Soviet Union, despite this genetics thing, was a very science-friendly state. They invested a ton in doing science, and much of that science is science that we think is correct. This genetics case is like a weird blip, but for a long time was held as like, it's an important blip, but it was held as like the normative example of how Soviet science was done. Much of Nazi science was also not this weird form, but the alienation of physicists in particular, given the bomb, and the fact that the racial laws meant they fired a large number of scientists who were at the top of their field, had very serious consequences for the state.
You know, it's funny. I just thought of something. You mentioned vaccination. So the part you talk about anti-vaxxers, the illustration that you used is really cool because it goes back to influenza. And you see, it's the same propaganda, if you will, that went on during COVID. But you also, you kind of give some, not credence, but you give some of them a pass, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think I would say that there's been anti-vax ideas since smallpox. So since the 18th century, when people were starting to do inoculation against smallpox. With smallpox inoculations, there's a small risk that you will contract smallpox and die. But if you don't, you're immune and you won't die later. And it's clearly, if you run the numbers, way better to take the risk than not. But there were people who argued against it, and it was heavily enforced by the state to make smallpox vaccinations mandatory. When I give them a pass, I give the COVID people a little bit of a pass at the beginning. I don't think I give anti-vax people a pass that much, because when we have a lot of data And we know that, yes, there's a risk that something bad will happen to you. But on the other hand, the public health effects of having a population that's not immune to measles is catastrophic. And so the state has a really compelling interest to try and force people to get measles vaccinations. What's going on with early COVID, and I wrote those passages in the spring of 2020, so like right at the beginning, was that we were getting COVID changes in interpretation every day, right? Like you have to quarantine your mail. You have to like not touch various objects. You need to wear masks. Well, first it was don't wear masks, then it was do wear masks, and then wear double masks or don't wear double masks. And that wasn't the fact that scientists don't know anything. It was that they were in an incredibly dynamic situation where they were learning new stuff all the time. And if you aren't very familiar with how science works, you think that when science changes, something's fishy about it because science is supposed to be reliable knowledge. But that's true for settled science. Science in the making is incredibly dynamic. And so what people were being exposed to was constantly changing recommendations, and that led them to believe that the information they were getting was unreliable. And that's a mistake on their part, but it's an understandable mistake because the way we teach people science is that science is immutable and has never changed. And instead of showing people the process by which people come to decisions means that scientists are going to be wrong a lot. But if you stick with the methods and you stick with the form of reasoning and the rigor, you will eventually get to something that's better. So I understand where they're coming from. I think that everybody should get vaccinated. Like that's I don't want people to walk away and think I'm anti-vax because I'm not.
Well, you know, if we're winding down now, but I could ask questions for hours, but a good way to conclude would be you take these guys like Immanuel Velikovsky, Worlds in Collision. That guy was really smart. And when I was 12 or 13 years old and I read it, this made perfect sense. Likewise with Tesla, you know, he was wacky, but
some of it works. Some of it makes sense.
He saved Edison. And then Donikin and Chariot of the Gods. When I read that as a kid, I thought, wow, I can't believe this actually happened. So those guys. So in conclusion, here's three guys that, you know, were geniuses.
But they are, in the sense of von Däniken and Velikovsky, not right, but they are clever. Like there's a really interesting idea in those. And this is something that I work out in the Pseudoscience Wars book more than I do in this one. But there's like, we could decide as a society that we want all of our science to be really top-notch, solid, pure knowledge. If we did that, we'd have no innovation of any kind. We would just believe the same things our fathers believed and our grandfathers believed, but it would be really reliable stuff. Earth is round, oxygen exists, stuff like that. There would be no string theory. There would be no quantum computing. There would be all sorts of things we wouldn't do because it's too uncertain. Or we could have the floodgates open and all knowledge claims are up for grabs. If we did that, we'd never know anything because there'd be no time to investigate all the wacky claims people make, some of which might be true. And Velikovsky, Tesla, and von Däniken are in the middle there, where they make quite daring, bold claims, some of which are interesting and potentially fruitful, and some of which are definitely not. But it takes time to work it out. And as a society, we have to decide whether we want to have complete orthodoxy or complete anarchy. And we really have something in the middle, but the middle is uncomfortable because we don't know. Sometimes we exclude stuff that's actually pretty good. And sometimes we include stuff that's kind of zany and wrong. But that place is the medium where the scientific community now lives. And that uncomfortableness is just part of our condition. That's where we're going to have to be.
Isn't that a good way to end? Because that's as close as you're going to come to the definition that you said was vague at the outset, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a vague definition, but we have to trust, and it does involve trust, the mechanisms of knowledge production that we have, which are very heterogeneous. There's not just one method, there are many methods. But we have to trust that eventually we'll be better off than we are now. We'll know more than we do before. And at any one point in time, I can't tell you this theory is correct, but I can lay my bets and hope for the best. And that's basically what the scientific community does every day in their course of work.
And that's a good arc and a good way to conclude. And I thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today. This has
My
been
pleasure. Great talking with you.
Likewise.